A black woman helped a mountain man in a blizzard. The next morning, he built her a cabin that changed everything. "Please don't die on me," the determined woman whispers, dragging the half-frozen stranger into her broken wagon as the storm rages around them. The townspeople had already written her off as just another freed slave heading nowhere, certain she'd perish in the wilderness like countless forgotten souls before her. They couldn't see past her skin to recognize the sharp mind and iron will that had carried her this far alone. The mysterious mountain man carries secrets darker than the Colorado night, secrets that powerful men would kill to keep buried. His survival depends on staying hidden, but her act of mercy has bound their fates together in ways neither can imagine. Both are running from pasts that refuse to stay dead, and both possess hidden strengths that could either save them or destroy everything they've fought to build. Will their unlikely alliance survive long enough to uncover the truth that could set them free? Or will the forces hunting them bury their secrets forever in the snow? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The wagon wheel cracked with a sound like breaking bones. Clara Bell felt her heart sink as the wooden spokes splintered against the frozen ground. Snow whipped across the Colorado mountains with merciless fury, and darkness was falling fast. She climbed down to inspect the damage. The wheel was beyond repair. Her meager supplies wouldn't last 3 days in this weather, and the nearest town lay 2 days behind her. The storm showed no signs of stopping. Clara pulled her thin coat tighter. She had fled the last settlement after the storekeeper refused to sell her food, and the local men made their intentions clear with leering stares and whispered threats. A woman traveling alone drew attention. A black woman traveling alone drew danger. The wind howled through the pine trees like a living thing. Clara unhitched her horse and led the animal to a cluster of boulders that offered some protection. She gathered what firewood she could find before the storm worsened. Her hands shook as she struck the flint. The kindling caught, and a small flame flickered to life. She fed it carefully, knowing this fire meant the difference between survival and death. Movement caught her eye through the swirling snow. A dark shape stumbled between the trees, moving erratically. Clara grabbed a burning branch and held it high. A man collapsed 20 feet from her wagon. He lay motionless in the snow, his buckskin clothing torn and blood-stained. Clara watched him for several minutes, waiting for any sign of movement. He groaned and tried to lift his head. Blood matted his dark hair, and his lips had turned blue from cold. Clara faced a choice that could cost her everything. She dropped the torch and ran to him. The man was massive, easily twice her weight. Clara grabbed his arms and began dragging him toward the wagon. Her boots slipped on the icy ground, but she refused to let go. The wagon offered little shelter, but it blocked the worst of the wind. Clara pulled the stranger inside and immediately noticed things that didn't fit. His hands were clean despite the wilderness living. His speech, though mumbled with fever, carried the precise diction of an educated man. She built up the fire and examined his wounds. A deep gash ran along his scalp, but no broken bones. Fever burned through him like a furnace. Clara tore strips from her spare dress and cleaned the wound with melted snow. The man muttered in his delirium. Words about a massacre, something about Crawford's lies. Clara listened carefully, filing away every detail. His belongings told a confusing story. Quality boots that had seen hard use, a knife with military precision in its design, and tucked beneath his coat, papers that made Clara's blood run cold. Wanted posters bore his likeness. The charges listed desertion, assault on a superior officer, and conspiracy. The reward offered enough money to buy a small farm. Clara stared at the unconscious man who now shared her wagon. She could turn him in when they reached civilization. The reward money would secure her future in ways she had never imagined possible. Instead, she shared her last portion of salt pork and gave him water from her dwindling supply. Through the long night, she tended his fever and kept the fire burning. Dawn broke gray and cold. Clara woke to find the stranger gone. Panic seized her until she heard the rhythmic sound of chopping wood. She peered outside to see him working with methodical precision. He had cleared a level area near a natural windbreak. Foundation stones lay in perfect rows, and a pile of cut timber grew beside them. The man worked despite his injuries, driven by some internal code Clara didn't understand. She climbed down from the wagon and approached him carefully. Up close, she noticed the scar on his right hand, a precise line that could only have come from a blade. His movements held military bearing even in his weakened state. He looked up when she drew near. His eyes were clear now, intelligent and measuring. Clara saw him take in her appearance, her obvious poverty, the determination that had kept her alive on the trail. She examined her broken wagon more carefully in daylight. The impact had loosened more than just the wheel. A hidden panel in the wagon bed had cracked open, revealing a space she never knew existed. Clara pried the panel free and gasped. Inside lay a leather portfolio, a small bag of gold coins, and an official-looking document sealed with wax. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal and unfolded the papers. A land deed, 160 acres of prime Colorado territory, legally transferred to Clara Bell by her former employer, Judge Morrison. The old man had hidden this gift, perhaps knowing she would need it someday. The gold coins numbered 25, enough to build a proper life. Clara sank to her knees in the snow, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in her circumstances. She was no longer a desperate wanderer. She was a landowner. The stranger continued building, asking no questions about her discovery. Clara studied the deed carefully, using the reading skills she had learned in secret while caring for the Morrison children. According to the surveyor's marks, they sat directly on her property. The cabin taking shape would rest on land that belonged to her. Clara Bell, who had spent her life owning nothing, now possessed more than most settlers could dream of. The implications hit her like a physical blow. She had resources now, options, the power to build something lasting. But powerful men were hunting the stranger who worked to shelter her. And in the Colorado Territory, a black woman claiming land ownership would face challenges that could prove more dangerous than any mountain blizzard. The sound of hammering filled the mountain air. Clara watched the stranger work with precision that spoke of military training. Each nail driven true, every board measured twice. He moved like a man accustomed to building things that needed to last. She studied the deed again, tracing the property boundaries with her finger. The description matched the terrain perfectly. The creek that wound through the valley, the stand of pine trees on the eastern ridge, the natural meadow where her broken wagon sat, all of it belonged to her now. The stranger paused in his work and glanced at the papers in her hands. His expression remained neutral, but Clara caught the quick assessment in his eyes. He recognized official documents when he saw them. Clara folded the deed carefully and tucked it inside her coat. The gold coins clinked softly in their leather pouch. $25 represented more money than she had ever possessed at one time. Combined with the land, it offered possibilities she had never dared imagine. She approached the cabin's foundation. The stranger had chosen the location well, positioning it to catch morning sun while sheltering from prevailing winds. A natural spring bubbled nearby, ensuring fresh water year-round. The man straightened from his work and faced her directly. Up close, Clara noticed details that told a story, calloused hands that knew both physical labor and careful craftsmanship, posture that never fully relaxed, always ready for threat or command, the kind of watchfulness that came from surviving dangerous situations. Clara pulled out a piece of paper and began sketching. Her years managing the Morrison household had taught her to plan efficiently. She drew the cabin's position, marked the spring, noted where corrals could be built for horses. The stranger watched her work with growing interest. Clara's drawings showed more than basic shelter. She envisioned a working ranch, complete with guest facilities for travelers crossing the mountain passes. She had learned business principles by listening to Judge Morrison discuss investments with his associates. The Colorado Territory was growing rapidly. People needed places to rest and resupply during long journeys. A well-positioned way station could generate steady income. Clara calculated expenses in her head: lumber, tools, livestock, supplies for the first winter. The gold coins would cover immediate needs, but she would need to generate revenue quickly to sustain operations. The stranger resumed building, but his movements had changed. He worked now with the focused intensity of a man constructing something important rather than simply repaying a debt. Clara realized he understood her vision. By midday, the cabin's frame began taking shape. Clara gathered stones from the creek bed for the fireplace foundation. The physical work felt good after days of travel and uncertainty. A sound from the ridge made them both freeze. Hoofbeats approached through the forest. Clara saw the stranger's hand move instinctively toward his knife. His entire body shifted into readiness for conflict. A man emerged from the trees riding a sturdy bay horse. He wore the simple black clothing of a traveling minister, with a worn leather Bible tucked in his saddlebags. His face showed the weathered kindness of someone accustomed to helping strangers. The rider dismounted and approached slowly, hands visible and movements peaceful. Clara felt some of the tension leave the stranger's shoulders, but he remained alert. The minister introduced himself as Reverend Jonas Whitmore. He had been traveling between settlements when the storm forced him to seek shelter. Smoke from their fire had drawn him to investigate. Clara studied the Reverend carefully. His eyes held genuine concern rather than the calculating assessment she had grown accustomed to from strangers. When he looked at her, he saw a person rather than a problem to be solved or avoided. Reverend Jonas examined the cabin construction with approval. He complimented the craftsmanship and asked practical questions about their plans for the property. Clara found herself explaining her vision for a way station and horse ranch. The minister listened with the focused attention of someone accustomed to evaluating character quickly. Clara realized he was making judgments about their trustworthiness and competence. His opinion could matter significantly in a territory where reputation determined survival. Clara made a decision that surprised her with its boldness. She showed Reverend Jonas the deed, explaining how she had discovered her inheritance. The minister examined the document carefully, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. The deed's authenticity was beyond question. Judge Morrison's seal and signature were well known throughout the territory. Reverend Jonas had performed the judge's funeral service just 6 months earlier. Clara watched understanding dawn in the minister's eyes. She was not simply another displaced person struggling to survive. She was a legitimate landowner with legal rights and the resources to defend them. The stranger continued working throughout their conversation, but Clara noticed he listened to every word. His building pace had increased, as if Reverend Jonas's presence added urgency to the construction. As afternoon shadows lengthened, the cabin's walls reached shoulder height. Clara helped by holding boards in position, while the stranger secured them with practiced efficiency. They worked together with growing coordination. Reverend Jonas assisted where he could, but primarily observed. Clara sensed he was evaluating both of them, forming opinions that would influence how others in the territory viewed their situation. The minister asked careful questions about their backgrounds. Clara shared edited versions of her history, emphasizing her education and work experience, while omitting details that might invite unwanted scrutiny. The stranger offered even less information, but his actions spoke clearly. His skill with tools, his understanding of construction principles, his automatic assumption of responsibility for Clara's safety. Reverend Jonas noticed everything. As evening approached, Clara realized her circumstances had fundamentally changed. She owned valuable property in a growing territory. She possessed both the resources and vision to build something substantial. Most importantly, she had found an ally whose capabilities complemented her own planning skills. But the wanted posters hidden in the stranger's belongings reminded her that their newfound stability balanced on the edge of a knife. Someone was hunting the man who had become essential to her survival. The cabin walls rose steadily over the following days. Clara and the stranger worked in natural rhythm, anticipating each other's needs without extensive conversation. She held boards while he hammered. He lifted heavy timbers while she positioned supports. Clara's mind raced with calculations and plans, The creek could power a small mill for grinding grain. The meadow would support 24 horses comfortably. The location offered perfect access to 3 major mountain passes used by travelers and freight wagons. She sketched floor plans in the dirt, marking areas for guest rooms, dining space, and supply storage. The stranger studied her drawings with growing understanding. His construction methods began incorporating her vision, adding structural elements that would support future expansion. Reverend Jonas returned on the 3rd day with supplies from the nearest settlement. He brought news that made Clara's stomach tighten with anxiety. A well-dressed banker named Silas Whitmore had been asking questions about land ownership in the area. The Reverend also carried disturbing reports about a bounty hunter making inquiries. The man claimed to be tracking a dangerous military deserter who posed a threat to honest settlers. He offered substantial rewards for information about strangers in the territory. Clara watched the stranger's reaction to this news. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his hands never paused in their work. He drove nails with mechanical precision while processing the implications of discovery. That evening, Clara made a decision. She confronted the stranger directly about his identity and the wanted poster she had found. The conversation could no longer be delayed. The stranger set down his tools and faced her fully. His real name was Jedediah Stone. He had served as a captain in the Union Army during the war's final campaigns. Court-martial proceedings had ended his military career under circumstances he described as complicated. Clara pressed for details. Jedediah's story emerged in careful pieces, like a man walking through a minefield of painful memories. He had refused orders that violated his moral code. The confrontation with his commanding officer had escalated beyond words. The scar on his hand came from that encounter. Major William Crawford had drawn his sword during their argument. Jedediah had defended himself, but military law favored officers over subordinates regardless of circumstances. Clara listened with the analytical skills Judge Morrison had unknowingly taught her. She identified inconsistencies in the official charges versus Jedediah's account. Military desertion carried specific penalties that didn't match the bounty hunter's description. She shared her own story in return. Born into slavery on a Virginia plantation, she had been sold to the Morrison family as a child. Judge Morrison's wife had recognized Clara's intelligence and taught her to read in secret. Clara's education had expanded when she became governess to the Morrison children. She attended their lessons, absorbed their textbooks, and learned to navigate complex social situations. The judge's death had freed her legally and financially, though she hadn't discovered the land deed until the wagon accident. Their mutual honesty created deeper trust. Clara understood why Jedediah had fled to the mountains. He grasped the courage required for her solitary journey across hostile territory. The next morning brought unwelcome visitors. Silas Whitmore arrived with 2 armed men and an air of confident authority. He examined Clara's deed with theatrical skepticism, pointing out supposed irregularities that he claimed invalidated the document. Clara's blood ran cold as she recognized the attempted theft. Whitmore intended to seize her property using legal intimidation and the threat of violence. He counted on her ignorance and isolation to prevent effective resistance, but Clara had absorbed more than reading skills from the Morrison household. She had observed countless legal discussions, witnessed contract negotiations, and understood the principles that governed property disputes. She challenged Whitmore's claims with precise questions about survey procedures, recording requirements, and territorial law. Her knowledge clearly surprised the banker, who had expected easy intimidation of an uneducated former slave. Jedediah positioned himself strategically during the confrontation. He said nothing, but his presence communicated readiness for violence if diplomacy failed. The banker's hired men noted his positioning and grew noticeably uncomfortable. Clara demanded to see Whitmore's authority to question valid territorial documents. She cited specific legal precedents that Judge Morrison had discussed in her hearing. Her confident presentation of facts undermined the banker's aggressive stance. Whitmore retreated with poorly concealed frustration. He promised to return with proper documentation, but Clara recognized the threat implicit in his words. Men like Whitmore rarely accepted defeat gracefully. Reverend Jonas witnessed the entire exchange. His respect for Clara's capabilities grew visibly as she dismantled the banker's legal arguments. He offered to carry messages to territorial authorities if she needed official support for her claims. That afternoon, Clara and Jedediah worked with increased urgency. The cabin needed completion before their enemies could organize more serious challenges. Every nail and board brought them closer to defensible shelter. Clara's strategic thinking impressed Jedediah as much as his craftsmanship impressed her. She planned multiple contingencies, identified potential allies, and calculated resources with military precision. Her mind worked like a general's, seeing patterns and possibilities others missed. As evening shadows lengthened, they achieved a crucial milestone. The cabin walls stood complete with a solid roof overhead. Windows and doors required finishing work, but they now possessed genuine shelter that would protect them through winter weather. Clara stood in the doorway of her first real home, surveying the valley that belonged to her. The transformation from desperate fugitive to property owner still felt surreal, but evidence surrounded her in solid timber and stone. Jedediah cleaned his tools with characteristic precision. Clara watched him work and realized how much she had come to depend on his steady competence. His presence made her bold plans seem achievable rather than foolishly optimistic. But the wanted posters and Whitmore's threats reminded her that their sanctuary remained precarious. Someone was hunting Jedediah with professional determination, and powerful interests coveted her land. The next phase of their survival would require different skills than building and planning. They would need to fight for what they had built, using intelligence and courage against enemies who possessed superior resources. Clara began forming strategies that would have made Judge Morrison proud of his former student. Clara spread the military documents across the cabin's rough-hewn table. Reverend Jonas had returned from Denver with more than supplies. His connections at the territorial courthouse had yielded copies of Jedediah's court-martial proceedings. The official records painted a different picture than the wanted poster suggested. Captain Jedediah Stone had been charged with insubordination and assault, but the trial transcripts revealed troubling inconsistencies. Key witnesses had disappeared before testifying. Evidence had been misfiled or lost entirely. Clara's analytical mind seized on the discrepancies. She had spent years listening to Judge Morrison discuss legal cases, absorbing the principles that separated legitimate proceedings from fraudulent ones. These documents reeked of manipulation. Jedediah provided missing context as Clara read through the charges. His unit had received orders to attack a peaceful Native American village suspected of harboring Confederate sympathizers. The intelligence was false, designed to eliminate a tribe that occupied valuable mineral deposits. Major William Crawford had insisted on following orders despite evidence of the village's innocence. Jedediah had refused to participate in what he considered murder. The confrontation between officers had escalated when Crawford drew his sword to enforce compliance. Clara studied the trial testimony carefully. Crawford claimed Jedediah had attacked him without provocation, seeking to desert his post and join Confederate forces. The story made little sense given Jedediah's exemplary service record, but military courts favored commanding officers in disputes with subordinates. The most disturbing revelation came buried in financial documents Reverend Jonas had uncovered. Crawford had resigned his commission immediately after the trial and joined a railroad development company. His first project involved acquiring the exact territory where the native village had stood. Clara began connecting pieces of a larger conspiracy. Crawford had fabricated the intelligence about Confederate sympathizers to justify attacking the village. When Jedediah threatened to expose the lie, Crawford had used military law to silence him. She cross-referenced Crawford's current business interests with territorial land records. His company had acquired thousands of acres through questionable deals, often targeting properties owned by native tribes, former slaves, and other marginalized groups with limited legal protection. The pattern became clear. Crawford systematically eliminated obstacles to his land acquisitions. Military records showed several other officers from Jedediah's unit had died in suspicious circumstances after the trial. Jedediah had survived only by fleeing to the mountains. Clara's investigation revealed Crawford's current position as vice president of Rocky Mountain Development Corporation. His company was actively pursuing mineral rights throughout Colorado Territory, using methods that skirted the edges of legality. More troubling was evidence that Crawford maintained private security forces. The bounty hunter seeking Jedediah worked for the railroad company, not federal marshals. Crawford was cleaning up loose ends that threatened his business empire. Clara shared her discoveries with Jedediah and Reverend Jonas. The minister's face grew grim as he absorbed the implications. Crawford's corruption extended far beyond one fraudulent court-martial. He was systematically stealing land from people who lacked political protection. Jedediah's reaction surprised Clara with its calm determination rather than anger. He had suspected Crawford's motivations but lacked proof. Clara's research provided the evidence needed to expose the conspiracy, if they could survive long enough to present it. Reverend Jonas brought disturbing news from his latest trip to town. The bounty hunter had recruited additional men and was systematically searching mountain settlements. Local authorities had been told Jedediah was a dangerous Confederate agent who posed a threat to territorial security. Clara realized their time was running out. Crawford's resources far exceeded anything they could muster for defense. Their only chance lay in exposing his crimes before he could eliminate them. She began drafting a comprehensive report detailing Crawford's conspiracy. Her years of managing Judge Morrison's correspondence had taught her to present complex information clearly and persuasively. The document would serve as both legal brief and insurance policy. Clara sent copies to multiple recipients through Reverend Jonas's network. Territorial officials, newspaper editors, and federal authorities would all receive evidence of Crawford's crimes. Even if she and Jedediah were killed, the truth would survive. The investigation had transformed Clara's understanding of their situation. They were not simply hiding from military justice. They were witnesses to massive fraud whose elimination would protect millions of dollars in illegal profits. Jedediah began preparing defensive positions around the cabin. His military training showed in every detail, from concealed firing positions to emergency escape routes. He worked with the focused intensity of a man expecting siege. Clara continued gathering intelligence through careful questioning of travelers passing through their valley. She learned that Crawford himself was reportedly traveling to Colorado Territory to oversee final land acquisitions before winter. His personal involvement suggested the timeline was accelerating. The bounty hunter's search pattern indicated he would reach their valley within days. Clara and Jedediah faced a choice between running deeper into the mountains or making a stand at the cabin they had built together. Clara's strategic analysis favored confrontation over flight. Running would only delay the inevitable while abandoning the legal protection her land ownership provided. Making a stand offered the possibility of forcing Crawford into public exposure of his methods. Reverend Jonas agreed to carry a final message to territorial authorities. Clara's letter demanded official protection for legitimate landowners threatened by private security forces operating without legal authority. She cited specific territorial laws that Crawford's men were violating. As evening settled over the valley, Clara stood in the doorway of their completed cabin. The structure represented more than shelter. It symbolized their refusal to be driven away by corruption and intimidation. Jedediah cleaned his weapons with methodical precision. Clara organized her documents and legal arguments. Both understood that the next few days would determine whether justice or power would prevail in Colorado Territory. The investigation had revealed enemies more dangerous than simple bounty hunters, but it had also exposed vulnerabilities in Crawford's seemingly impregnable position. Clara's mind raced with strategies that could turn their desperate situation into an opportunity for victory. The riders appeared at dawn, 6 men moving with military precision through the valley. Clara watched from the cabin window as they approached in formation, their leader wearing the tailored clothes of Eastern money rather than frontier practicality. Major William Crawford had come personally to finish what his court-martial had started. Clara recognized him from Jedediah's description, a man whose bearing projected authority earned through manipulation rather than merit. His pale eyes surveyed the valley with the calculating gaze of someone assessing valuable property. The bounty hunter Mason Greeley rode at Crawford's right hand, no longer pretending to work for federal authorities. His true allegiance was clear in the way he deferred to Crawford's commands and positioning. 4 additional gunmen completed their force, enough to overwhelm any resistance the cabin's defenders might offer. Clara felt her heart racing as the implications crystallized. Crawford had traveled hundreds of miles to handle this situation personally. Jedediah posed a threat significant enough to warrant a major railroad executive's direct attention. Jedediah checked his rifle and positioned himself at the cabin's front window. His movements held the calm efficiency of a soldier preparing for battle, but Clara saw tension in his shoulders that spoke of personal stakes beyond simple survival. Crawford called out from horseback, his voice carrying the false reasonableness of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation disguised as negotiation. He claimed to represent territorial law enforcement and demanded Jedediah's surrender for crimes against military authority. Clara stepped onto the cabin's front porch, her presence clearly surprising Crawford's group. She had dressed in her finest traveling clothes and carried herself with the dignity Judge Morrison had taught her through years of observation. Her appearance projected competence rather than desperation. She challenged Crawford's authority directly, demanding to see proper warrants and identification. Her questions were precise, based on legal knowledge that caught the supposed law enforcement officers off guard. Clara's confident presentation undermined their narrative of pursuing a dangerous fugitive. Crawford's mask of official righteousness slipped as Clara systematically dismantled his claims. She cited specific territorial laws regarding property rights and due process. Her education became a weapon more effective than Jedediah's rifle in exposing their enemy's true nature. The confrontation revealed Crawford's real purpose. He offered to purchase Clara's land at prices far below its actual value, claiming her deed contained irregularities that threatened its validity. The proposal was clearly coercion backed by armed force. Clara's refusal triggered Crawford's shift to direct threats. He no longer pretended to represent legitimate authority. The railroad company would acquire this property regardless of legal niceties. Clara and Jedediah could accept reasonable compensation or face consequences of continued resistance. Jedediah emerged from the cabin with his rifle visible but not directly threatening. His presence reminded everyone that negotiation was backed by the possibility of violence. Crawford's men shifted uncomfortably, recognizing military competence when they encountered it. Clara played her strongest card. She informed Crawford that detailed documentation of his crimes had been distributed to territorial officials, newspaper editors, and federal investigators. Killing the witnesses would no longer protect his conspiracy from exposure. Crawford's reaction confirmed Clara's analysis of his character. Faced with unexpected resistance from people he had dismissed as powerless, his composure cracked to reveal the calculating ruthlessness beneath his civilized exterior. The standoff stretched through long minutes as Crawford reassessed his options. Clara used the time to study his men, noting their reluctance to engage in direct confrontation with prepared defenders. These were hired gunmen, not soldiers committed to a cause. Reverend Jonas appeared on the ridge above the valley, accompanied by 3 territorial marshals and a federal investigator. Clara's messages had reached their intended recipients with perfect timing. Crawford found himself surrounded by legitimate law enforcement officials. The tables turned completely as the federal investigator presented Crawford with a warrant for his arrest on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and corruption. The evidence Clara had assembled formed the foundation for criminal proceedings that would expose his entire operation. Crawford's hired gunmen quickly distanced themselves from their employer as the legal situation collapsed around them. Mason Greeley attempted to claim he had been investigating Crawford independently, a transparent lie that impressed no one present. Clara watched Crawford's arrogance transform into desperate calculation as he realized the scope of his exposure. Years of careful conspiracy were unraveling because he had underestimated 2 people he considered beneath his concern. The federal investigator examined Clara's documentation with obvious admiration for its thoroughness and legal precision. Her analysis had provided exactly the evidence needed to build an airtight case against Crawford's criminal enterprise. Crawford made a final attempt to salvage his position by offering to cooperate with authorities in exchange for reduced charges. He portrayed himself as a businessman who had been misled by subordinates rather than the architect of systematic fraud. Clara's prepared testimony demolished his defense before it could gain traction. She presented documented proof of Crawford's personal involvement in every aspect of the conspiracy, from the fraudulent court-martial to the current intimidation campaign. The arrest proceeded with formal efficiency as Crawford was taken into custody. His business associates would face similar charges based on evidence Clara's investigation had uncovered. The railroad company's land acquisitions would be reviewed for legal validity. Jedediah watched his former commanding officer led away in chains with quiet satisfaction rather than triumphant celebration. Justice had been served through legal channels rather than violence, validating his original refusal to participate in Crawford's crimes. Clara felt a profound sense of accomplishment as she realized what they had achieved. Two people society had written off as powerless had exposed and defeated a conspiracy that threatened the rights of countless others. The territorial marshal officially confirmed Clara's land ownership and promised protection for legitimate property holders throughout the region. Crawford's private army was disbanded, and his victims would have legal recourse for recovering stolen property. As evening approached, Clara and Jedediah stood together in their valley, free from the threats that had shadowed their new beginning. The cabin they had built represented more than shelter. It had become the foundation for justice and a symbol of what determination could accomplish against overwhelming odds. The territorial courtroom filled beyond capacity on the morning of Crawford's trial. Clara entered wearing her finest dress, carrying a leather portfolio that contained months of meticulous research. Spectators turned to observe the woman who had exposed one of Colorado Territory's most powerful men. Judge Harrison presided with the grave dignity befitting such serious charges. The federal prosecutor had built his case entirely on Clara's documented evidence, acknowledging her investigative work as the foundation for successful prosecution. Clara took her place at the witness table with calm confidence. Her years observing Judge Morrison's legal proceedings had prepared her for this moment. She understood courtroom dynamics, the importance of clear presentation, and the power of undeniable facts. The prosecutor guided Clara through her testimony with respectful efficiency. She explained how broken wagon wheels had revealed her inheritance, leading to encounters with both Jedediah and Crawford's conspiracy. Her narrative connected every piece of evidence in logical sequence. Clara's presentation impressed the courtroom with its methodical precision. She cited specific documents, dates, and witnesses with the accuracy of a trained legal clerk. Her education, earned through years of careful observation and secret study, manifested as formidable courtroom competence. Crawford's defense attorney attempted to discredit Clara's testimony by questioning her qualifications and motives. The strategy backfired spectacularly as Clara demonstrated superior knowledge of territorial law and military regulations. Her responses revealed the defense's ignorance while highlighting her thorough preparation. Jedediah testified about the fraudulent court-martial and Crawford's true motives for eliminating the Native American village. His military bearing and precise recollection of events provided powerful corroboration for Clara's documentary evidence. The conspiracy's scope became undeniably clear. Multiple witnesses testified to Crawford's pattern of illegal land acquisitions and intimidation tactics. Reverend Jonas spoke to Clara's character and the accuracy of her research. Federal investigators confirmed the authenticity of documents Clara had uncovered through her methodical investigation. The defense presented no credible counter-narrative. Crawford's crimes were too well documented and his motives too transparent for effective denial. His attorney resorted to technical objections that only delayed the inevitable verdict. Clara watched Crawford throughout the proceedings, noting his transformation from confident authority figure to desperate defendant. The man who had destroyed careers and stolen land now faced the justice he had denied others through years of systematic corruption. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Crawford would spend decades in federal prison, while his illegal business empire faced complete dismantlement. Justice had prevailed through legal channels rather than frontier violence. Clara felt profound satisfaction as the judge sentenced Crawford to 25 years for conspiracy, fraud, and abuse of military authority. The railroad company faced massive financial penalties and would be forced to return all illegally acquired properties to their rightful owners. Mason Greeley received a lighter sentence in exchange for his cooperation with ongoing investigations. His testimony revealed the extent of Crawford's criminal network and helped authorities identify other victims of the land acquisition scheme. The trial's conclusion marked the beginning of Clara and Jedediah's new life together. They returned to their valley as respected members of the territorial community rather than fugitive outcasts. Clara's reputation for intelligence and integrity had been established beyond question. Clara transformed her cabin into the foundation for a thriving business. Her way station provided essential services for travelers crossing the mountain passes, while her horse ranch supplied quality animals to settlers throughout the region. The gold coins from her inheritance had multiplied through careful investment and hard work. Jedediah's military engineering skills proved invaluable for territorial development projects. He designed bridges, surveyed roads, and consulted on defensive fortifications. His reputation was fully restored. With federal authorities offering him positions, he politely declined in favor of civilian life. Their partnership evolved into deep personal connection based on mutual respect and shared values. Clara's strategic intelligence complemented Jedediah's practical capabilities perfectly. They built something greater together than either could have achieved alone. Clara established Colorado Territory's first integrated school, welcoming children regardless of background or social status. Her own education, earned through determination and sacrifice, became the foundation for providing opportunities to others facing similar barriers. The school occupied a building constructed with the same careful craftsmanship Jedediah had brought to their original cabin. Clara taught reading, writing, mathematics, and practical skills that would help her students succeed in a rapidly changing territory. Reverend Jonas officiated at Clara and Jedediah's wedding ceremony 6 months after Crawford's conviction. The celebration brought together the diverse community that had rallied to support their fight for justice. Former enemies became friends united by shared respect for courage and integrity. Clara's influence extended beyond education into territorial politics. Officials regularly consulted her on matters requiring careful analysis and strategic thinking. Her investigative skills had proven invaluable for uncovering corruption and ensuring honest governance. The cabin that had begun as desperate shelter evolved into the heart of a prosperous ranch operation. Clara and Jedediah expanded the original structure, adding guest rooms, dining facilities, and meeting spaces for community gatherings. Spring arrived with news that filled Clara with joy and anticipation. She was carrying their first child, a symbol of new life growing from the foundation they had built together. The baby would be born into a world where justice had triumphed over corruption. Clara stood on her front porch watching sunrise paint the mountain peaks gold and crimson. The valley spread before her in peaceful abundance, transformed from a place of desperate refuge into a thriving homestead that provided security and purpose. Jedediah joined her, wrapping his arms around her growing belly with gentle reverence for the life they had created together. Two people whom society had dismissed as powerless had not merely survived but flourished, creating something beautiful from the ashes of their individual struggles. The morning light illuminated their domain with promise and possibility. Clara Bell, former slave turned landowner, educator, and pillar of her community, smiled as she contemplated the future spreading before them like the endless Colorado sky.